Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to welcome you and thank you again for joining us for this year's Virtual Visiting Scholar webinar series. I am Dr. Stephanie Page. I am the Community Engagement Manager for the ARC Network. This portion of our series will feature the second cohort of our Virtual Visiting Scholars program, and hopefully you were able to attend last week where we welcomed Dr. Beth Michnek. This program, the Virtual Visiting Scholars Program, empowers scholars to complete meta-synthesis and meta-analyses of existing literature on intersectional gender equity in STEM. Before we introduce our speaker today, I would like to take a few moments to go over some housekeeping items with you. First, as I mentioned, today's webinar is being recorded and we will share that with registrants and also post it on our website. Live captioning, Today, live captioning is provided by Carla Ray, who is with Interpreter Now, and we really are grateful for being able to partner with them. And if you are actually interested in their services, please visit interpreter-now.com. As a short introduction to our webinar platform, Zoom, I'd like to point out just a couple of useful features in the app. First, if you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window, you will see a few different options. To the right is the icon for captioning. By selecting the caret in it, that will allow you to actually customize your captioning experience. In the center are options for Q&A and chat. Toward the end of today's webinar, we'll actually utilize the Q&A to hear your questions, and we'll pull from those questions to ask today's speaker. We'll have about 5 to 10 minutes at the end for questions. I also want to share just a little bit about the ARC Network. The goal of the ARC Network is to create and cultivate a broad community that bridges the gap between researchers and practitioners. As the STEM equity brain trust, the ARC Network works to promote systemic change by collecting previous work and producing new perspectives, methods, and interventions through convenings, a curated resource library, emerging research workshops, a virtual visiting scholar program, as I mentioned today is our purpose, and online events like this one. The ARC Network is built on and works through a framework integrating inclusion, intersectionality, and intentionality. We strive to ensure that our work accounts for the social stratifications that intertwine to determine the unique inequities that folk experience. The ARC Network is funded by the National Science Foundation's Advanced Program, and the Women in Engineering Proactive Network, or WEPAN, serves as our home organization. As many of you may know, the ARC Network transitioned to WEPAN in February of this year, and we are thrilled for what's to come. To learn more about the ARC Network, we encourage you to visit equityandstem.org, where you can join the community if you haven't already. I will now introduce the Executive Director of WEPAN, Dr. Ursula Sims, to say a couple of words before we introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Page. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. As Dr. Page mentioned, the ARC Network moved to WEPAN in February, and that was only after a month of me joining WEPAN, and I was very pleased and thrilled that WEPAN was going to become the new home of the ARC Network, particularly given the synergy between the work that WEPAN does to provide a systemic change to affect the field diversity in the field of engineering, and then the work that the ARC Network is doing of promoting systemic change to address gender equity in STEM, particularly the STEM professoriate, through their lens of intersectionality, intentionality, inclusivity. So I am looking forward to more opportunities like this where we can, share our webinar series and have other events. And I would now like to turn it over to our WEPAN Director of Research and Constituent Relations, and also the Principal Investigator of the ARC Network Grant, Dr. Heather Metcalf.
Thank you, Ursula. I am really thrilled to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Teresa Nelson. Her work has been deeply guided by her interest in innovation, what it means, what it is, how and whom it impacts, and how it is actualized as entrepreneurship by individuals, teams, and companies. As an active researcher, Dr. Nelson is known globally for her scholarship related to women and gender and diversity in entrepreneurship and family business. As an Obama-era appointee to the National Women's Business Council, a group appointed to advise Congress, the White House, and the Small Business Administration on issues of women in business, she began to specialize in women's roles in commercializing science. She now works with the MIT Innovation Alliance, Astia, and the Healthcare Businesswomen's Association, among others, to build understanding and organizational capabilities around inclusion as a strategic business practice, particularly in the life sciences. Dr. Nelson is co-founder of the Impact Seat, a consultancy on issues of organizational capabilities of diversity and inclusion. She's also a professor of strategic management in the business school at Simmons University in Boston and a faculty affiliate in the Center for Gender and Organizations. She's taught on 5 continents to students at the doctoral master and executive masters and undergraduate levels. She is a sought-after speaker on topics such as women entrepreneurs in science, the context of entrepreneurship, inclusion as a strategic management practice, and the entrepreneur's journey. Dr. Nelson joins us today to share her work as a 2019-2020 virtual visiting scholar with the ARC Network, where she completed a meta-synthesis of the research on academic entrepreneurship related to women faculty in STEM. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nelson as she shares her work with us today.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Heather. I really appreciate that. And I'm glad to be here. And I want to thank everyone. I've got the NSF, the ART Network, WePan, and especially Heather Metcalf for her support during this process. You know, for me, this was an interesting journey because I've been working on this topic from various lenses and points of view for about 7 years now. And it was tremendous for me to have the opportunity to sort of sit with the literature again and to look at it and make sense of what it had to tell us in the context of the work I've been doing over that time. So let me share my screen. I have slides that I'm happy to share with you. And I look forward to your questions and your thoughts. I know that I have one point of view. It's developing into quite a strong point of view in terms of my deep feeling that we need to have more activism around this topic. And I'm happy to be able to share some of those thoughts with you today and hopefully into the future. So there we go. All right, so 3 parts to a relatively short agenda, maybe half an hour or so. Why this research matters, a review of the particular metasynthesis project, and then moving forward where I think we go from there. So here's my fundamental research question for the project. What is the state of knowledge on women and gender with an intersectionality concern as regards faculty participation in academic entrepreneurship? And the first thing, of course, is to get clear on a few definitions. Academic entrepreneurship. So this involves the engagement of university faculty, tying their research to private sector development of products, services, and experiences intended for commercial sale. And then also, because so many deep relationships with early innovation occur with the federal government as customers, as buyers, we do include that idea of government acquisition as well. And of course, familiar to you all is the idea of sex and gender. And I acknowledge myself as a theoretical social constructionist who sees both sex and gender as being socially constructed, while sex has to do with the notion of biological features, and gender, given a binary lens, with culturally embedded assumptions of what men can and should do and what women can and should do. So trying to understand those concepts in the context of academic entrepreneurship is what I intend to do. So why this research matters. There's a lot of stories that we can tell about why innovation in STEM that leads to commercialization is important. There's a story about social justice and equity in terms of who's involved. There's a story about US competitiveness and developing that capability. There's a story about lost companies and the value that they would have brought, public values. And to me, though, it's about an innovation future. I've always been, as Heather mentioned, focused on the idea of where the economy will be 25 years from now. What will it look like? Who will be involved? Who's going to benefit? And what can we do now to provide any sort of structure that innovation moves in the direction of public welfare? So that's my sort of fundamental orientation. And as many of you are aware, but I'm going to just show a couple of these slides, certainly my work about academic entrepreneurship sits in this idea of the relationship and the interactions of the academy, industry, and government. And for anyone who's looked at that historically, we know that this relationship is established in countries and varies by culture. And the United States has its own particular flavor and a set of rules and laws and regulations that have formed it. And that these connections between these ecosystem elements, particularly between the academy and industry, which is my focus, are more or less porous, but not entirely so. And what we've seen since the 2007-2008 economic crisis is a lot of policy work, conversation, shifting intentionally or unintentionally, complicated relationships about the state of the academy, the funding of the academy, what being a faculty member is, what the role is, how we think of that as a career for a faculty member. So that's sort of my fundamental conceptual orientation. And thinking of the relationship from an entrepreneurship point of view between those boundaries where intellectual property and other knowledge through various roles that we associate with entrepreneurship. So clearly founding businesses, which is now not an uncommon practice for faculty, serving as board members of companies and serving as scientific advisory board members, more casual advisors, doing contract work, all of that flowing from the academy into industry. And of course, on the other side, contracts, relationships, and donations from industry. And very interested in how those avenues of connection and how that boundary relates to gender and to women in a comprehensive way. So for the first time today, I want to just provide some context. There are three things that sort of add to and contextualize my metasynthesis that I think are important to recognize. And I'm going to talk about them a little bit because I know you have access to my paper and have those results directly. But for more than a year, I worked under the Sloan Foundation at MIT to assess the engagement of female faculty in entrepreneurial work. So we looked at 337 faculty in 7 MIT departments in the schools of science and engineering. And these were the departments where we would expect to have the most entrepreneurship activity. And I just want to tell you a little bit about our findings, and we're working on developing ways to share this data and this story with the public more widely. So we did look for the set of faculty in place in 2019, back through their careers at MIT, which took us from 1974 to 2019. And female faculty represented 22% of the faculty in those 7 departments. And we looked at both founding a company, board of directors, and scientific advisory board members. These 337 faculty founded 261 companies during their tenure at MIT, and 8% of those were founded by women faculty. And that would be as a solo entrepreneur or in a co-founding situation. These are some of our findings. I have 3 slides here that I wanted to share with you. If we're looking by number of companies founded by faculty, we can see in the greenish brown color, female faculty founding rates as compared to male faculty founding rates over their tenure as faculty. And this goes by department. These are the 7 departments across the top that we examined. And here we're looking at all 3 roles, which are really important when we think about the influence that people have on how STEM develops, what companies come forward and get funded, and who's involved in sort of setting the policy for what products and services move forward and how innovation is built and shared. So for each of the departments, we have 3 lines, one for serving as founders, the second is boards of directors, and the third as scientific advisory board members. And then the last slide that I want to share with you has to do with our analysis of the co-founding networks across the departments. So when we think about how faculty members form relationships with other faculty members, we certainly saw that the male-to-male dyads and triads were the most common founding method, with women here represented in the outer sphere in those departments, 1, 2, 3 women being involved in a co-founding situation. So the sort of takeaway from this study was that the percentage of women faculty in these departments is still very low when we consider parity as a measure, when we consider how the pipeline has developed, and when we consider the ability of an elite institution like MIT to pick from the best and brightest that we have to offer. And that then translates into this situation of access, or the lack of it, to these extraordinary external capital resource networks that are available to faculty at a place like MIT. And given their standing in innovation productivity, this is so essential, right? Really open doors between venture capitalists and faculty members, with some faculty, you know, I mean, MIT built the biotech industry, right? Faculty at MIT in league with venture capital and considers to do that. And that extends to many other departments as well. The second thing that I've kind of worked on and been really attentive to is the SBIR program. And, you know, from my perspective, what we see is just a continuing review of SBIR failing in its demand from Congress to be inclusive and to engage women and people of marginalized groups in that process of SBIR awards. And this is so critical from an entrepreneurship point of view, because for ventures that are truly high potential, that are going to influence the economy in a substantial way, SBIR is often the first stop, right? It's the way that an entrepreneur, a scientist, shows that they have the capacity to consider commercialization as a path, since that's the founding principle of SBIR, is to serve as this bridge between science and further development of a commercial nature. The other thing that's been of great concern to me lately is this conversation that's happening about changing the fundamental faculty tenure and promotion rules in terms of including innovation and entrepreneurship as criteria for tenure and promotion. And I suppose with my gender and woman lens, right, I would say if women are already behind and excluded from the networks that they need to access entrepreneurship at that level, if they want to, right, then this move toward further commercializing the research productivity of faculty just raises a lot of questions. And I'm concerned that this is moving forward without what I consider to be a sufficient and necessary consideration of the impact on promotion and tenure for women in the academy. So those are three big areas that I've been working on and thinking about, and that connects to the meta synthesis project, because I, as the research question states, was really interested in how the literature has dealt with this issue of academic entrepreneurship in general, and then also using a sex and gender lens and intersectionality to see what's there and whether we can rely on the academy from the research perspective to be raising and discussing some of these issues. So just very briefly about the project. Morally motivated by feminism. There's a publication bias in terms of these being English language publications. It is the last 20 years, which is a long time in terms of how the economy shifts and moves. So I think we've got a pretty good sense of what's going on. I used Web of Science as my base, and of course looked widely across natural sciences as well as social sciences. And we did have articles from the fields, if you will, right? From radiologists and from doctors and dentists that were talking about academic entrepreneurship from their roles working in hospitals or other organizations. And I also looked at the advanced grants to see if there were publications coming out of those grants specifically. I also reviewed second tier citations from the first set of papers that were selected for the analysis. And then I did a third secondary search for NGO and government reports on these topics. So it was interesting to me that I located 22 meta reviews that were research question adjacent. I mean, given that I only had 123 articles in the meta synthesis, that's a lot of meta reviews, though of course these existed at the wider level of academic entrepreneurship itself, whereas the selected database had at least some sex and gender reference in it in order to qualify for the more intensive study. So I've categorized here, and you'll see in the paper, the subject areas of these meta reviews, and I'll say a little bit more about that when I come to the conclusion section. Gender was mentioned as a feature of academic entrepreneurship in 4 reviews, but only in a cursory way. And this is so familiar to me as I move from field to field. When we're talking about any sort of business or commercial purpose, except in select fields like high growth entrepreneurship, where a very strong cadre of women working in gender have become well established. There are specialized journals in the field and conferences and good support networks there. But if other than that, women is generally used as a variable that may be usually secondary in any analysis, and it's interpreted without a theoretical lens. Just sort of women are, women do, here's what women are. All right, and none of them included any demographic characteristics other than sex and gender. The focus of the meta reviews was really on knowledge transfer. How do we commercialize knowledge? We can look at different levels of analysis from the person to the organization to the ecosystem, or we can look at specific practices. We can look at mentoring or technology transfer or patenting and licensing. And so the body of the work was, I used the phrase of a practical nature, trying to facilitate and understand how that boundary between academia and industry functions. For the metasynthesis itself, there were 123 articles and reports from 2001 to 2020. 80% were empirical. Many of them focused on the patenting and licensing data that's available at the national level. 89% really focused on academic entrepreneurship, and only 11% took a sex and gender focus that I would call in some way substantial. 50% were in these three journals, which are, I would call them more practice policy oriented. And I think they've grown up around the development and strengthening of university technology transfer offices over time. There was only one article of a study directly discussing African American and Black women, and there were only 8 studies that mentioned social identity characteristics beyond sex and gender. And these were not sophisticated, I would say, from the standpoint of someone taking a intersectionality lens. I did a review of all the articles to understand what they were saying about what might be best practices for women to succeed in academic entrepreneurship. And they focused on these 3 areas: career planning, research planning, and university resources. And of critical importance, the majority are of the fix the women approach, what women need to do in order to be successful. And, you know, I would sort of fit that into a 70s, 80s gender model of research. And I was disappointed that there wasn't more rich gender theory involved. So the research across Web of Science with those other references was really organizational in nature. There was a strong bend to practice policy journals, and patenting and licensing was a great percentage of the data that was used. The issue of women academics and their any sort of issues of that sex and gender present as employees and participants and colleagues in that system was not very present. Research in diversity and inclusion was not engaged. And, you know, one thing that I was appreciative of the fact that 4 of the meta reviews were looking at academic entrepreneurship with more of a critical eye in terms of its impact on the academy, on the purpose of a university, on its foundational principles. And the literature in academic entrepreneurship that included some reference to gender and women, you know, overall, there's this underlying assumption that academic entrepreneurship is good and that more is better. So not a critical look. So tying that, you know, the metasynthesis to the earlier sections, the 3 issues that concern me, you know, where I stand today, right? So here you all are, experts in the field with me. My supposition is that nobody's really got a handle on this university, industry, government, infrastructure relationships in terms of the seriousness of women faculty members being left behind in the drive for academic entrepreneurship. Yes, there's a story about individuals. There's a story about faculty. There's a story about students. I've had women faculty members with extraordinary academic credentials tell me that they are hesitant to advise graduate students because they don't understand entrepreneurship, and that is such a drive for students coming into graduate schools because they don't feel that getting a job as a faculty member is likely enough for them to put all their eggs in that basket. As an organizational scholar and a gender scholar, I would say that these are truly complex, wicked problems, which, which require untangling and are extraordinarily complicated to get a handle on. And, probably obvious to say that managing for the pipeline is not enough, though that tends to be the answer that everyone goes to. A couple ideas here on moving forward then. What's next? Even as part of the National Women's Business Council, repeatedly working to interact with the SBIR system, I've felt very frustrated that there's just not a champion to make change. And from a policy perspective, really thinking about whose role is it? Like what happens when we have such deep, wicked, complex problems? Who solves them? Is it Congress's problem because they need to demand accountability for the enormous investments that the government and people make in the infrastructure that drives fundamental research that becomes commercial products? Is it the SBIR system because it is a flagship entity that has a direct mandate, that talks a lot about wanting to be better and has done things? I don't think any one unit here, I'm not trying to like cast the finger, because I don't think any one unit can untangle this by themselves. What's the role of the ARC network? Advance, terrific, right? But where does academic entrepreneurship fit in? I mean, I think maybe in a way it's the kind of problem that a small group of people are having an extraordinarily outsized impact on the economy, on the world. When we look at, for example, femtech and how it's arising, how women are coming together as investors to invest in products and services that women need that have not been developed so far, right? We know that there's a need for a variety of voices. We know we have the literature on diversity to show us that we will have a better system and better outcomes and more creativity. Other federal agencies, universities certainly have an outsized role to play in terms of the employees that they have and their commitments to equity. Nonprofit think tank sector, the entrepreneurship ecosystem. On the last point, I would share that I'm a member of something called the Boston Biotech Working Group that was founded by Susan Hockfield, who's the former president of MIT. We had a meeting last Tuesday. The chair of the corporators of MIT was there. We had venture capitalists. We've got people from the media, the chairman of the Boston Globe, right? Like all these people trying to put their minds together about how we solve this problem, just in this one economic area where Boston serves as such a major hub for the world. Yeah, we've been meeting for 2 years, and good stuff is coming out, but it's difficult. So what are my recommendations when I put all that together? I think one of the things that I've learned over the course of the last 10 years is that by people, I mean policymakers, researchers, journalists. I really think that the literature on diversity and inclusion is so critical to back up gender work, ideas about intersectionality, and that we need more of that theoretical work to be embedded in what we do, even on a completely practice basis. There's a lot of information on best practices around exclusion and inclusion. As I move from pod to pod and people you know, in small groups are talking about this, like at a university. They think their setting is special, but when you use diversity and inclusion, right, as a guide, you see that for every organization, there's some sort of attraction, hiring, promotion, retention process for the people that are involved. And there's a lot to be shared across those boundaries. Someone, right? We need a national clearinghouse on valid and reliable standards and practices around academic entrepreneurship, and a continuing conversation, you know, recognizing that the national academies have done great reports from time to time, but that something has to be more engaged on a regular basis. I think SBIR is a major linchpin. And, you know, personally, I've run into continuing rejections on being able to get access to the data for SBIR applications because I'm told it's confidential. And I just think that's a problem that NSF can solve by having a favored researcher pool. I mean, people are getting into the US Census data and, you know, the IRS data, academics who have been vetted. And I think that NSF could do that as well. I think we have to look at onboarding of the entrepreneurs that get into that program. We need to demand accountability around that and follow companies from launch to beyond. So one of the things that's really interested me is going from the universities to SBIR and then seeing what happens. And that data is there's very little data, there's very little research to show how SBIR companies transform into funded companies with sales over the long run. Universities just have to get serious about hiring more women in STEM, including women of color. You know, we can help them, but it's got to be a commitment from the top. And there need to be enforceable norms that men will include women in their academic entrepreneurship activities. And there needs to be metrics there for women being present and being presented with opportunities. So just being there is not enough. I think Congress should demand accountability of SBIR for its mandate around inclusion of women and other marginalized groups. And I think we need to define our ideal innovation future differently. I think it's going to have holes in it. I think our STEM development process now has holes in it. And I think we can document that by the innovation that's going on in the funding sphere. And then I'm just going to finish up with 6 research recommendations. So I wanted to provide a guide for academics or other people who are doing research around things that are clear, at least to me, that we need to be working on. Look for the research that is putting academic entrepreneurship and women into an institutional and economic context. I think that a lot of times work on universities and even in government doesn't tend to take a business focus. And there's a lot of good work there in entrepreneurship that can be helpful. I think someone should ask the question, why has the university and the wider ecosystem of AE been so ineffectual in addressing gender inequities? And maybe some of these things have happened and I don't know about them, and I would appreciate knowing about them. But it's just getting time for this problem to be understood better by more people. Let me put it that way. I think we could have a national effort to understand you know, what many of the things that Advance is trying to do, looking specifically at AE in colleges and universities and sharing that more widely. And I know there's work now going on that's looking at the intersection of I-Core and Advance, and I think that's fabulous. And how does that just get to everyone? I think that's important. I do think we need a comprehensive careers-backed focus on post-PhD life for women in STEM. From my work in career paths, right, it's not just going into academia anymore. People are moving between corporate life, entrepreneurship, and university life on a regular basis. And at institutions like MIT and Stanford, that's for some people a kind of revolving door, taking a few years off, starting a company, going to work for a corporation, coming back to teach. And I think we need to understand that and its impact on women better. We clearly need more intersectional views. Gender is not the only social identity dimension that needs our attention. And then I think we need to look beyond that idea of biases and challenges, that language that's around restriction. I think that we need to be looking at the variety of ways. We have a glass half empty mentality, even with everything that I said, right, about what's not right and what needs work. There's a lot of wonderful stuff going on. Women are launching companies, they're launching big companies, they're choosing to define a new role for themselves as faculty members. And it's important that we recognize that and honor that and use that as a model for people who want to follow that path. Okay, so those are my comments, and I really want to thank everyone. And I look forward to your questions. And I wanted to say, because I wanted you to have access to those research questions, if anyone would like those, I thought I would put those in the chat. So I opened up a Google Sheets, and you should be able to go and get those if you'd like them. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Teresa, for sharing all of the hard work that you've done, not just as a virtual visiting scholar, but leading up to what helped you conceptualize the project and the policy and advocacy work that you've done in this space. I think it's such important work. We do have a number of really great questions in the Q&A that I'll moderate for you.
Okay.
So I think I'll start not in the order that the questions were asked, but with the what and like what is the issue, and move into a little bit of the why and what can we do kinds of questions. So the first question that we have is from Joan Herbers, and she's wondering, do we know whether men and women differ in the way that they commercialize, so the mechanisms that they use? For example, do women license more and men found more companies, or are there any differences that people maybe who are a part of our audience today may not be aware of because they may not be doing the in-depth research and academic entrepreneurship in the way that you are?
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Joan. And I'm going to start with one of my my most firmly held beliefs, which is I honestly think we got to get away from the gender binary. I have seen throughout my research career that when we talk about women and men, we just don't learn that much. And I'm not here saying like we need to add intersex, which that would be fine too, but the complexity of the intersectional nature of sex for us, right? So we have to be talking about young professional or pre-tenure faculty members. We have to be talking about senior faculty members. We have to be talking about people of different cultural orientations, different ages, different ethnicities, nativity. We just have to move to categories from a binary. I think that's the idea. Now, that said, yes, if we kind of bundle everything together, what do we know? What I think we know is that women found smaller companies that are not as successful in the long run. But what we also know is that there's a very small cadre of people who found extraordinary companies, right? Like if you found a Biogen that goes on to sort of rule in its area of the economy. That's just a difference of kind. And I think that's where we can embed ourselves more in the innovation literature, and with full respect, because I think little companies are great, right? Like, understand the role of a little company that perhaps sells itself or its products and services to a larger company, medium-sized companies, large companies, and then these mega influencers, and that's an important distinction. I think in terms of how they do it, I mean, we know things like women are more likely to partner with other women, which, you know, the problem with something like that is that a lot of the things that we say women do, I think in some part they do because of the challenges they have. And it's a rational and necessary response, though it's not what men are doing. And we do have a substantial literature now that's growing, at least in high growth entrepreneurship. It may not be in academic entrepreneurship specifically, that women's ways of managing and networking are very successful. And that the historical comparisons that we had out of sociology, for example, that loose ties, that a lot of relationships with a lot of people, which was found to be on average in general better, doesn't necessarily hold true for women, and that their strong ties, you know, are very effective. So that's just one example. I don't know, wouldn't it be great to do an SBIR study and find out, you know, more about this? I mean, there's so many other questions that we need to know. But, you know, most women decide not to take that path as academics. And I think it's important to recognize that, right? They just, not just, because it's not a bad thing to not want to be an entrepreneur if you're a faculty member. I think that's wonderful and it's honorable. My whole emphasis is, do they have the opportunity and turn it down? That I think it's fine, right? Like, that's okay. That can live in a DEI world. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Teresa. Another question we have is from Judith Sheff. She wants to know, what should we do to increase female PI participation in SBIR?
Well, that's a big one. You know, there's so many answers. One of the things I've talked about for a long time that I've never seen successfully done is, I think that universities have to seriously embrace training and education programs for PhD students and postdocs, so that by the time they get to an opportunity for entrepreneurship, they understand what it is. Because I was just working the other day with NACME, which is graduate Black and Brown students in PhDs in engineering, right? And just the level of knowledge about what entrepreneurship is and how you do it and where the decisions are getting made. You end up in a postdoc and you see other people working on entrepreneurship and you don't know it. So, I mean, that's the first thing I think we have to address. I'm just going to be very bold because this is how I'm feeling about this issue. I don't think universities can solve that problem. I think somebody outside of the universities has to provide education directly to students, graduate students, PhD students, and postdocs about entrepreneurship. And that should just be available to anyone. And that would be a huge service. And you have to know what it's about and what it's like and how you do it to some extent, and how you proceed and who you need to meet and who you need to have for an advisor. I mean, there's just a mindset around entrepreneurship that has historically and currently is passed through social networks and does not reach all the people who have the potential to do this work that want to. So, you know, that's sort of my first answer. And then I think universities can mentor people who want to do it. They can certainly incentivize them. I mean, in the world of diversity and inclusion work, right, we're moving from this idea of equal access, right, to race and gender conscious hiring and incentivizing. And, you know, you just have to, as an organization, make the commitment to be part of the solution. And that requires that you offer differing incentives and education opportunities to people that are marginalized.
Thank you, Teresa. Another question that we have is from Erin Kelly about the promotion and tenure policy changes that you mentioned. She says, my understanding about the proposed promotion and tenure policy changes is that innovation and entrepreneurship activities would be included among qualifying factors, not that these activities would be required. Does it make a difference with respect to the policies when innovation and entrepreneurship is an option among research, teaching, and service categories, as opposed to a P&T requirement?
Thank you. And for anyone who's been through the tenure process, which I have twice, you know that it's a very opaque, social, ill-defined process. As much as we try to provide metrics around research, teaching, and service, there is really no way to measure the quality of the work that's been done. And, again, I would say I'm not necessarily against the idea of it. I think that, but I would say that I'm suspicious, not of anyone. Like, I'm not as suspicious of people or the people proposing it, but I'm suspicious of the impact on the system overall. And entrepreneurship and innovation have always been included under the service capacity of faculty, from my point of view, right? Service to the profession, service to society has always been included as values. So I don't think it's ever been restricted. I think this is just raising it to another level. And I think it will create more conflict for faculty who see that they don't have the qualifications in that area, even if it's at the recommended level.
Thank you for that. Another question we have is from Laurel Smith Dorr, who's done also a lot of work in this area.
Of course, you're in my study, Laurel.
Laurel thanks you for the presentation and says the intersectional dimension is really key. A report we did with Immigrant Learning Center in Malden on mass biotech founders about a decade or so ago found that immigrant entrepreneurs were important, and something like 40% of all biotech firms had immigrant founders, but they were mostly men. How can we think about continuing fostering entrepreneurs who are foreign born, but of all genders in Massachusetts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, just to make it even more complicated, as you know, Laurel, there's such a strong importance in recognizing living immigrants and first-generation immigrants and even second-generation immigrants in terms of their cultural orientation and their and the influence of that on them. I'm trying to think about anything that I would specifically say. Our research at MIT didn't extend to any intersectional factors beyond gender, beyond sex. But my anecdotal experience is that women who are involved in entrepreneurship tend to be first and second generation immigrants, but I just don't know. I would also ask you back, right? Like, do you think that there's a particular reason, is there a reason to hook immigrant status onto sex? Could we identify reasons that make it more complex? I don't know what those would be, but that would be the first place I would start. Sometimes we're just women and sometimes we're intersectional, right? It's that's always a tricky question.
Yeah, I think while we always have an intersection of different identities that shape our experiences, some of them become more salient in certain contexts than others.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Right.
Another question we have from Joan is, can academia learn how to do this better from other quasi-academic sectors like the federal labs?
Yeah, I really believe that I think that's the thing we're missing, that idea that every context is different. I think that there are ways that we work together as people And that at a fundamental level, a lot of this comes from that. And that if we learn to do it well, and it's just like us, right? If we learn to do this well in one part of our life, it transfers into the other. If I do it well in my family, I'm better off at work doing it as well. And I think that that's true for organizations. And there's, every organization at the end of the day has some sort of quirks and specialties that have to be accounted for. But there's so much that runs through people gathering together to do productive work that can be transferred. And I'm a big fan of exemplars, and I don't think we know enough about those. I'd like to see more, more writing and publication in the social media sphere about what Advance and ARC are doing, for example, and, amazing women entrepreneurs who are academics that no one would ever know their name, right? No one would ever understand that the work that they're doing. They don't even sort of qualify as entrepreneurs in our economic way that we talk about, folks.
Thank you so much. We have one last question, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Stephanie to close us out today. From Michelle Dudash. She asks, it appears that if we include academic entrepreneurship as part of scholarship instead of service and promotion and tenure, the bias you have identified against women in academic entrepreneurship could make the situation worse. Can you say something to that point?
If we included entrepreneurship as research, was that what the question was?
Yeah, if we include it as part of scholarship instead of service and P&T requirements.
And the first thing that comes to mind, and of course, all these questions are great and require a lot more thought than I'm able to give them, is what's happening at the university level in terms of what the university is and how it operates and what its values are is really in flux as well, right? And so research is being redefined anyway in terms of tenure requirements, and things that historically would not have qualified as research are making it through. And I think part of that is because more and more universities are hiring non-PhD faculty members, and they're trying to work on ways to integrate them more into the academy by doing educational, research on education practices or on things like practice. So I know a number of schools, for example, who've had really serious debates about whether something like the Harvard Business Review should be considered a scholarship, right? So from my point of view, theory is so valuable that anything that diminishes the concentration on the process of scholarship from a theoretical perspective is of concern. If we wanted to define a category like practical scholarship, or really to distinguish that in a dramatic way for certain categories of faculty, I don't know, maybe that could be a path forward. But I certainly at elite institutions, even if someone is not going to found a company or sort of go across that bridge to industry in that, sort of doorway sense, if they at least understand the capabilities of their research in terms of licensing and patenting and other intellectual property, which is not now true, right? Like, that's a great way to be part of that conversation by owning the science that they've been a part of. And too many people just don't understand. Again, talk to extraordinary women faculty at amazing universities who never thought to think about whether any aspect of their research had an IP potential. What a shame.
Thank you so much, Teresa. I really appreciate your responses to these questions and your presentation today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. And I'm going to pass it over to Stephanie to offer up some final words today.
Thank you so much, Teresa. That was such an engaging presentation and of course discussion. My brain is just ticking with even more thoughts. We could spend a whole entire hour, if not more, on this topic. I want to let the audience know that I have included the link to Teresa's report that is accessible on our site. That link is in the chat. I also want to encourage you to join us for our next webinar in the Virtual Visiting Scholars series, which will feature Dr. Allison Mateus, who will discuss her work on understandings of gender in STEM higher education. And that will be on June 24th at 3 p.m. Eastern. We will also host a second town hall on ensuring equity in institutional COVID-19 responses on June 3rd. And we really want to hear from our community on this really critical topic. So we encourage you to both join us and share in the discussion on issues and challenges with integrating equity during this time. And on June 4th, we will co-host another joint webinar with WePan featuring Dr. Alyssa Panich, who will discuss in part the efforts of their advanced grant at UC Davis. Those links for registration to those webinars are, again, as I said, in the chat. As always, we want to know about your experience with our webinar and again, this specific webinar. So please, if you have the time and the bandwidth, consider completing our feedback survey. We try to keep it brief to just allow us to hear from you on your experience with our webinars. And with that said, thank you so much for taking the time out to join us in today's presentation. Thank you again to our speaker, Dr. Teresa Nelson. We look forward to seeing you again in more ARC events and programming, and I hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.